They're our ancestors. They're beautiful to look at. We were supposed to be obliterated. They couldn't do it. And thank you, Edward, for showing all those old people too.
Where his images actually do the most damage, it creates a false sense of who Indigenous people are that is still to this day applied to our appearances.
Edward Curtis's masterwork, The North American Indian, was hailed at the time of its launch as the biggest literary undertaking since the publication of the King James Bible. His unprecedented magnum opus shaped American perspectives on Native Americans over the past century. Through his iconic images, people have been interpreting and misinterpreting Native Americans and debating whether his work has contributed to the preservation or the destruction of the understanding of Native American identity. Despite his triumph of creating thousands of evocative and highly influential photographs of Native Americans, as well as documenting the culture of over 80 indigenous tribes in a multimedia format, Edward Curtis's work perpetuated stereotypes while ignoring the tragic contemporary struggles of Native peoples. This picture of Red Cloud, the legendary Oglala Sioux war chief, was taken in 1905 by Edward Sheriff Curtis, who at the time was one of America's most prominent photographers. He was born in rural poverty in Wisconsin in 1868, the same year when Red Cloud signed the Treaty of Laramie after his victory against the United States. The treaty gave the Sioux all the land west of the Missouri River in the Dakota Territory, including their sacred Black Hills. In the intervening years, the federal government reneged on the promises made in the Treaty of Laramie, as it did on most other treaties made with other tribes. By the turn of the 20th century, all Native Americans had been reduced to living on reservations on 2% of their historic lands in the name of westward expansion, homesteaders, railroads, the gold rush, while only 237,000 natives were counted as opposed to an estimated 10 million before the Europeans arrived. The Treaty of Laramie also included provisions to build missionary schools on reservations and encouraged the Sioux to take up farming. After the military wars ended, a silent war continued, fought by the American government through the Religious Crimes Code of 1883 and the Dawes Act of 1887, which outlawed all Native rituals, traditions, and languages, systematically attempted to destroy tribal communities and families, and forcibly removed Indian children into missionary boarding schools. This forced assimilation was a cultural genocide. In 1904, the Seattle Times celebrated Curtis's triumph of having taken never-before-seen pictures of the Navajo Yebache dance. Curtis, with only a sixth-grade education by this time living in Seattle, had become a celebrity photographer of American high society, but he was profoundly drawn and deeply impressed by the spirituality of Native Americans, and managed to gain their trust. I have met ethnologists and archaeologists, but none of them seem to come so close to the Indian as Curtis, so close that he seems a part of their life. Driven by the conventional understanding of his era that the native peoples were vanishing, Curtis felt an urgency to document their culture. From this came the idea of the North American Indian, an epic 20-volume comprehensive record in 2.5 million words and 2,200 pictures about the art, rituals, and languages of all tribes living west of the Mississippi, showing the natives in a romanticized pre-contact ideal untouched by modern civilization. President Teddy Roosevelt wrote the foreword, and it is viewed by many as the largest anthropological enterprise ever undertaken. In an arduous process over 30 years, the Curtis team observed and interviewed natives, took their pictures, and documented their cultures in various forms of media. With an Edison wax cylinder, Curtis made 10,000 audio recordings of native songs and history. In 1911, to rave reviews, his picture opera debuted at Carnegie Hall. His film, In the Land of the Headhunters, from 1914, was the first feature-length documentary of Native Americans. He was hailed by the press, a gem of motion picture art, and called a genius. It seemed that Edward Curtis was destined for success. Despite his unparalleled achievement in documentation of Native heritage, from the perspective of modern critics, Curtis's work is irredeemably linked to the highly racialized stereotype of the vanishing Indian. Curtis opened Volume 1 with this image called The Vanishing Race and added, "The Indians as a race are passing into the darkness of an unknown future." Social Darwinism permeated early 20th century white American understanding and viewed the Indians as an inferior, primitive, less human race frozen in time, for whom extinction was inevitable unless they managed to assimilate into the superior white civilization. Curtis erased any sign of modernity, staged and dressed Native Americans as he imagined them, and romanticized noble savages, a stereotype of a primitive but peaceful people at one with nature. Many think that Curtis not only projected but cemented these stereotypes through his iconic images, and that they misrepresent true Native American identity and deny the tragic Native American past and reality.
The romanticism was more about the fact that this was going to become their country, that the American Indian footprint would be gone. You would feel that they just kind of disappeared. You'd be able to have this image of them having their full set of cultural beliefs and traditions intact, because the last time we saw them, they were majestic and beautiful and all those things, so there never really was any suffering. So I think that that's one of the things that kind of makes Edward S. Curtis a difficult character to reconcile our relationship with.
Curtis spent many summers on various reservations where he witnessed the poverty and repression of Native Americans, yet he didn't document that. He photographed Geronimo, the legendary Apache leader at the infamous Carlisle Indian School, but not the children as young as 5 who had been removed from their parents with the aim to turn them into civilized Christians. Cutting their hair, adopting English names, learning a trade or farming, abandoning their native tongues were the ingredients of this cultural genocide. Graves of young children by the school are a reminder of the often tragic circumstances and abuse in these boarding schools. As much as he is being faulted for having ignored the tragic life of Native Americans, many share the opposing perspective that at a time when the U.S. government wanted to eliminate any trace of Indianness, Curtis devoted his life to preserving it, and that his passion to immortalize Native cultures resulted both in an artistic triumph and a magisterial ethnographic record. There won't be anything left of them in a few generations, and it's a tragedy, a national tragedy. He wrote in 1903, "I want to make them live forever."
I hear people criticizing me, carried around shirts, but he did a monumental job. And if he didn't come along and record this, the loss would be tremendous, incalculable loss. So when people start criticizing stereotypes, I look at my great-grandfather, he's not a stereotype. He can't stage that, you can't stage the eyes and the determination.
With a soft-focus lens, Curtis created powerful close-ups of Indigenous faces that humanized them in an unprecedented way. Often taking photographs against the sun, the silhouettes of humans blended into nature, and the resulting landscape immortalized the beauty of the American West in images that have become iconic today. In 1906, when Curtis sought funding for the North American Indian from banker J.P. Morgan, he wrote, "To further safeguard the patron of the work, I can insure my life." Little did he know then that this work would cost him his famous studio, his home, his health, and his marriage. Although he got funding from Mr. Morgan, he disastrously underestimated the time and cost of the project. It was always massively underfunded, even though Curtis never took a salary and spent all of his own money on his life's calling. Between chasing buyers and working in the field, Curtis was hospitalized for exhaustion and mental breakdowns. His wife divorced him, and he was forced to sell even the copyrights of his work. In 1928, 60-year-old Curtis set out on his last field trip to Alaska with one assistant and his daughter Beth. This was 30 years after his first Alaskan trip on the lavish Harriman expedition. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The Harriman expedition was a public spectacle widely followed by the international press. By 1928, however, the public had lost interest in Native Americans, and Curtis was a forgotten, penniless man, yet he finished the last volume of the North American Indian. He died in obscurity in 1952. I have never seen pictures relating to Indians which, combined with artistic feeling, can compare with these pictures by Curtis. What will they be 100 years from now? The North American Indian is a unique American treasure, a vital compendium of anthropological data and evocative images that have shaped American perspectives on Native Americans for the past century. However, Curtis has staged many of his pictures, and it is essential that we view them in terms of Curtis's own racialized era, being aware of the stereotypes he conveyed and cemented, and that he romanticized his Indian subjects and their way of life. Although Native Americans are thriving today and their population has grown tenfold, many Native artists feel that they need to define their own identity in order to erase the damaging Curtis stereotypes. For example, Project 562, started in 2012 by Native artist Makita Wilbur, is a massive undertaking to document all Native tribes through a contemporary lens. Despite Curtis's work perpetuating stereotypes and ignoring the tragic struggles of Native peoples, his triumph of creating thousands of iconic photographs, as well as documenting the culture of over 80 indigenous tribes in multiple formats, remains a vital and unparalleled contribution to the preservation of Native American heritage.